In the great year of 1953, movie audiences were shocked and stunned as they bared witness to the greatest alien invasion ever put on film. Never before has such a battle of man versus extraterrestrial looked so impressive, creating a landmark movie, of which others would try to replicate. So in 1953, War of the Worlds came out, and it was a game changer in the science fiction genre, as for its time, the battle between humans and the invading Martians was unlike anything ever previously seen on the big screen. Like, this completely took people by surprise and wowed them. So today we're going to celebrate this landmark classic movie by exploring 10 things that you didn't know about the War of the Worlds, the 1953 original. Hey guys and gals, we're yet again returning to the 1950s, to a time when the Martians were invading, where, despite the terrifying impending danger, the locals still found the time to put on an evening square dance. Because darn it, we still need to do our evening square dances. Alien invasions be damned. So I'll stop talking now, as we check out War of the Worlds. Number 10. A War Beyond Imagination. War of the Worlds is indeed based on the 1898 book by celebrated fantasy author H.G. Wells. It tells the terrifying story of Martians invading old Victorian England in the turn of the 20th century, with a great deal of the action taking place on the streets of London. The Martians arrive in cylinders and have sinister plans to invade and conquer, but ultimately are defeated by lack of immunity to Earth's pathogens. Always being aware of social issues and wanting to reflect them in his stories, it's said that something that inspired Wells to write War of the Worlds was the European colonisation on Aboriginal Tasmanians right here in Australia. The book would become one of the most influential and celebrated stories in the science fiction genre, and in later years would spread to other mediums, like a radio play, where in 1938 Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre Company would broadcast a radio play of War of the Worlds on the CBS radio network. But it was a disaster, as the play started off sounding like a real news bulletin, informing listeners that the Martians are invading, to which many frantic listeners thought that this was a real news bulletin and that Martians were really invading, which caused mass panic and hysteria, with this chapter of the War of the Worlds legacy going down in infamy. Number 9. Paramount Pictures first got involved during the silent movie era. Paramount Pictures' long and complicated history with War of the Worlds started in 1925, where the studio bought the movie rights for the story and famed director Cecil B. DeMille was going to direct. However, difficulties occurred which prevented the movie from taking off at that stage. Throughout the 30s, there were several more attempts to get War of the Worlds off the ground, with Alfred Hitchcock at one stage even dabbling with the idea of making a War of the Worlds movie. For many years, the War of the Worlds production had completely stalled and was really going nowhere. It was just sitting there doing nothing. However, by 1951, filmmaker and animator George Pal was hired to helm the production, so this beast can finally be made into a movie. He had just previously produced the science fiction hit movie Destination Moon, so under his guidance, the production was finally taking off. Incidentally, Pal would go on to direct fellow H.G. Wells' adaptation of The Time Machine in 1960. Number 8. War of the Worlds of a Cold War era. So unlike the original story, which takes place in Victorian England, it was decided to modernise the formula, and instead focus the action in 1950s California, in the fictional town of Linda Rosa. It was also decided to make the Martian invasion in this updated version to be an allegory of post-World War II Cold War tensions. Back in the early 50s, people had just observed and in many cases lived through the catastrophic horrors and destructions of World War II. At that stage, it was all still new and fresh in people's minds. And now there was a new fear, the Red Menace, as the newspapers would call it. Ever-increasing ideological fears and tensions between the Western world and the Soviet Union. a new threat, with it being feared that this conflict could plummet us back to war and total destruction. So for this 1950s version of War of the Worlds, it was a conscious decision to make the Martians an allegory of real-life Cold War fears of that time. A time of uncertainty, of being fearful of unknown advanced technologies and the possibility of a superior enemy. Number 7, the studio wanted less gloom and more romance. Ooh la la. So coming on board as director for this exciting, modern for its time War of the Worlds epic was American film and television director Brian Haskin, who had previously directed the live-action Disney movie Treasure Island and Tarzan's Peril. Gene Barry was cast as the dashing Dr. Clayton Forrester, a scientist who investigates the strange occurrences and gets caught up in the war. And Anne Robinson was cast as Sylvia Van Buren, a USC librarian who becomes the love interest of Dr. Clayton Forrester. It was originally intended for the scientist character to already be married, but they get separated from each other during the alien invasion, where throughout the story the scientist was to be on the search for his wife among all the chaos and destruction, much like how the journalist in the original book gets separated from his wife. However, Paramount were like, nope, we don't want to see a married couple get separated. That's not romantic. People who go to a movie theatre on a date don't want to see that. It was actually Paramount Pictures head, Don Hartman, who insisted that the story should instead feature a scientist who falls in love with a female lead, with their love blossoming as the story goes on. I guess it was just seen as sexier than a scientist spending his time frantically looking for his lost wife. Number 6, filming started without legal rights. Filming for War of the Worlds took place at several locations, including Corona, California, Los Angeles, and of course the Paramount Studio lot, also located in Los Angeles. Now there was something of a panic when filming had started. Apparently the production were just days into the shoot when it was discovered that the production wasn't entirely legal. As although Paramount Pictures bought the rights to making a War of the Worlds movie back in 1925, which was to be a silent film, however they didn't have the rights to make a War of the Worlds movie with sound, as part of the original 1925 contract was to make a War of the Worlds silent movie. So due to that technicality, the studio didn't have the rights to make a War of the Worlds movie with sound. Now keep in mind, back in the 20s, movies with sound, or as they were known as, talkies, weren't a thing yet. Hence the fact that it wouldn't have been part of the contract to make a War of the Worlds movie that has sound. So to rectify this, Paramount had to very quickly get permission and devise a new contract with the Wells estate. So thankfully the problem was fixed, and the 1953 War of the Worlds movie could legally have sound. What a strange, weird legal issue to get caught into. Number 5, the abandoned plan for a 3D invasion. George Pal had quite the innovative idea, which would have been groundbreaking for its time, to have the movie's third act filmed in 3D. So that way, movie audiences could really feel like they're in this terrifying alien invasion when they go to see the movie at movie theatres. So viewers don't just watch the movie, but fully immerse themselves in it. However, at that stage, 3D technology, by way of filming and projecting, was still relatively new and experimental, and so it was felt that it would be too impractical and too costly for the production. So they just stuck to the good old-fashioned 2D way of filming, and the 3D aspect was dropped. However, had the production forked out the extra cash and effort needed to film in 3D, it may have actually really been a spectacular event that would have changed everything. As the horror movie House of Wax, which came out just a few days after War of the Worlds, did indeed feature 3D, and it led to great successes for that film, with the 3D aspect being a standout feature that really broke ground for movie audiences when they experienced it. And to think if War of the Worlds did use 3D, then it actually would have beaten House of Wax to the punch, as it was released a few days earlier. So War of the Worlds could have been the big 3D movie that everyone was raving about instead of House of Wax. War of the Worlds may have been the movie that launched 3D technology in movies, and it may have been the movie getting all the 3D hype and acclaim, but nope, as fate would have it, that ended up going to House of Wax. Number 4, most of the movie's budget went towards special effects. Out of War of the Worlds' $2 million budget, it's said that about $1.4 million of that budget went solely into the movie's special effects. George Pal knew the effects in War of the Worlds not only had to be convincing, but groundbreaking. They had to create something that was a real game changer that would draw in movie audiences. You know, get people talking and rushing to their local movie theatres to see it. A great deal of the action depended on miniature model work, such as the Martian attack on the City Hall. And the miniatures had to look convincing and as spectacular as possible. In order to avoid the Martian war machines looking like stereotypical UFO saucers, they were actually designed after manta rays. And yeah, when you know that, they do have the shape of a manta ray. The special effects of War of the Worlds are indeed impressive and have a craft about them that you don't see in modern movies. And so War of the Worlds would go on to win an Academy Award for Best Special Effects at the 1954 Academy Awards. Sadly though, the movie's special effects director, Gordon Jennings, died from a heart attack shortly before War of the Worlds movie premiere, so he never got to see his hard work and efforts on War of the World win that award. Still though, he did have 6 other Academy Awards under his belt for previous movies, so there's that. Number 3, War of the Worlds has a truly bizarre cameo. So War of the Worlds producer George Pal was good friends with Woody Woodpecker creator Walter Lantz, of which Pal would always try to somehow insert the iconic cartoon character into movies he was working on as a way of sort of blessing his friend with good luck with his fortunes and his Woody Woodpecker character. And War of the Worlds is no exception. Now I know what you're all thinking, but I've seen War of the Worlds tons of times. Woody Woodpecker isn't in the movie. I think I'd notice if there was a cartoon character walking around amongst all the mayhem. Well, Woody Woodpecker's inclusion is more subtle, as thanks to the DVD commentary, actors Gene Barry and Anne Robinson explain that Woody Woodpecker was placed on top of a tree, center screen, just as the Martian meteor crashes from the sky. And look at that, if you look really carefully, you are just sort of able to see him. But yeah, he isn't so easy to see, but he's there. Well, who'd have thought that the whole time the movie was hiding a Woody in plain sight? Number 2, War of the Worlds Unleashed. War of the Worlds was released in April 1953, and it was financially successful, bringing in $2 million in rentals, which is about $23 million by today's currency, making it the highest earning science fiction movie of that year. War of the Worlds also got widespread acclaim, with the Washington Post stating, quote, "To put it gently, terrific," and the Monthly Film Bulletin describing it as the best post-war science fiction movie. The movie's effects, scale, tension, quality, and use of colour were also heavily praised. However, not everyone was impressed. The British Film Classification Board had given War of the Worlds an X rating, which prohibited anyone under the age of 16 from being able to see the movie for reasons of the movie just being too horrific. Yeah, they thought that War of the Worlds was just so bad and horrible it had to be rated X. There were protests in order to try and give the movie a reduced rating, but nope, the British Classification Board was sticking to their guns. The rating would eventually be dropped to a lower rating where under 16s could actually watch the movie, but this didn't happen till 1981, nearly 30 years after its theatrical release. Ugh, embarrassing. War of the Worlds would have other post-release issues, where during the 60s, original 3-strip Technicolor prints of the movie were abandoned in favour of a cheaper colour print stock. This affected the movie's presentation greatly in terms of War of the Worlds lighting, image resolution, and above all, its special effects, where thanks to this lower quality colour print, wires could now be seen in the scenes involving the Martian war machines. To make matters worse, according to Wikipedia, because of this, each home media transfer of the movie just got worse and worse with each release, with the wires and strings becoming ever more visible, with some critics even questioning if the effects were even that good to begin with, as in maybe they just didn't notice the wires the first time they saw the film. Maybe they were so caught up in the big screen spectacle they didn't realise that these effects were actually quite bad. But no, that is not the case. The wires were only visible due to a downgrade in quality in the colour transfer. However, the movie's original 3-strip Technicolor presentation was put back into the movie in 2018 for a 4K restoration. So now War of the Worlds can finally go back to looking how it did when it was originally released. Wires and strings be gone. Number 1. Legacy of the Worlds. So in the wake of the 1953 War of the Worlds movie, there have been many further War of the World adaptations, both theatrically and on the small screen. Now here are some that stood out to me. In 1988 there was a War of the Worlds TV series, which actually acted as a sequel to the 1953 movie, adding to that continuity. It even saw the return of Anne Robinson, who reprises her role as Sylvia Van Buren. Lasting for 2 seasons, this follow-up series had more of an emphasis on horror and didn't shy away from gore, and went more in a possessing human bodies, invasion of the body snatchers style direction. And looking at the show's promotional artwork, which displays a giant Martian hand grabbing the entire planet, makes me wonder if whoever made the movie poster for the 2005 remake borrowed heavily from this illustration. Because look at that. They are very similar. Speaking of which, the most famous reimagining of War of the Worlds is probably Steven Spielberg's 2005 remake, which starred Tom Cruise. This dark and grim version takes more of a post-9/11 approach to the story, showing the full terror of being under attack. Unlike the 1953 movie, which feels exciting, this time it feels morbid and melancholy. There's nothing to celebrate about here, this is a tragedy, where the story now focuses on a single father trying to save his kids during the invasion. However, in 2005, there were actually 2 other War of the Worlds remakes that were released, both titled H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and both were straight-to-video releases. And both were probably made to capitalize on the Steven Spielberg movie, or possibly even make customers think that they are that movie. Possibly. In 2012, there was an animated movie called War of the Worlds Goliath, which acts as a sequel to the original book. In 2019, there was a 3-part BBC miniseries based on War of the Worlds. And not to be outdone by the Brits, that same year there was also a Fox network TV series of War of the Worlds. And this one lasted for 3 seasons, all the way up to 2022. And finally, there was a 2025 remake, which premiered on Amazon Prime and became known as the Ice Cube War of the Worlds. And this one pretty much was universally hated by everyone, as it mainly consists of Ice Cube looking at computer screens and ultimately turns into a commercial for Amazon products. Yeah, I'm not too sure if that's what H.G. Wells had in mind when he wrote War of the Worlds. I somehow don't believe that he was thinking to himself, I just have to make this captivating story that's going to change the way people observe the universe. Oh, and make them shop with Amazon Prime Air. And the movie is currently enjoying a less than impressive 4% on Rotten Tomatoes, and some would probably even argue that that's too high. And no doubt in the future there will be many more War of the World adaptations to come. But I think most people agree the granddaddy of War of the World movies, the 1953 one, is the greatest and most iconic of them all. The one that stands out, not just for War of the Worlds, but alien invasion movies in general. The movie was even listed as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress for Preservation in the National Film Registry. So without a doubt, the 1953 adaptation has become one of the most important movies of all time, and a grand achievement in cinema, which, upon its release, shocked and delighted its audiences, and still does, even to this day. War of the Worlds 1953 will always be a science fiction classic. The first time a full-scale intergalactic war between man and visitors from beyond the stars was put on screen. Yep, this is the one where that trope started. So naturally, it was a groundbreaking movie, and will always be an important movie in the history of cinema. Anyway, I'm Minty, and I'll always take the practical effects in War of the Worlds 1953 over CGI any day. Strings and wires and all. See ya!